Hello, my name is Terry Stewart. I'm sorry I can't be there at the conference. Hopefully this video will make up for it. So I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience at the University of Waterloo. And what I want to talk about is how we are using and thinking about large-scale neural networks. And how that fits into a potentially novel or interestingly different use of FPGAs and neural networks. The core idea is I want to build large complex systems using only neural networks. So that is, I want to do something like having lots and lots of different neural networks, connecting them all together and having that system as a whole do some sort of complex behavior, as opposed to having a sort of a neural network being used as a component in a larger system that is done with traditional programming. This I want to think of as almost programming with neurons. So I want to build my entire system with whatever it is, the behavior that I want, my full computer program, using neural networks. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, the initial focus in our lab was actually just trying to understand biology. Brains do a lot of very complex, interesting computation, and as far as anyone can tell, that's what they're primarily doing, or what they are using for all of that computation, is neural networks. And we think that as we've been making progress in understanding how biology does computation with neural networks, we've ended up with a system that is sort of a very different approach to computation, and one that is very well suited for mapping onto FPGAs. So that's why we felt it would be interesting to include that in this tutorial. Now, it's always worth sort of questioning, well, why would we want to use neurons? So, normal computing is pretty good for a lot of things. Why would we want to have this biological inspiration? Why copy from biology? Why not stick with traditional von Neumann computing? And I think the clearest answer to that is that, well, there's been some recent very big successes in terms of using neural networks for doing things like classification, all the entire area of deep learning. These are very directly neurally inspired and have ended up outperforming a lot of the older techniques that were more traditional computing. Our hope is that there's other possibilities. There's other places where trying to do things with neural networks will also give us successes. The brain does a lot of different things using neurons, and by looking at sort of how neurons might approach a particular algorithm, we may end up with very different computing approaches. The brain does motor control, planning, pattern completion, one-shot learning, language. That's a lot of different things. At the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience, we actually research pretty much all of those. In this talk, I'm going to give an example of a pattern completion system where neurons end up being nicer than real systems. But then we'll also see a bunch of examples of motor control, where using neurons to do motor control turns out to have interesting advantages in terms of robustness and flexibility. And all of those things, if all of those things can work, and if they can map onto FPGAs well, then I think we have some very interesting computing possibilities. All right, so what can we do with neural networks? How complex behavior can we get? The video that you're seeing right now is the most complex fully neural system in terms of doing behavioral type tasks. So doing full tasks where vision, cognition, and motor actions are all controlled by neural networks, and it's just neural networks. So every single step inside the system is run with a neural network. This is the model called SPAWN, published in 2012 in Science. And it was mostly a demonstration that this sort of approach is possible and maps onto, and in this particular case, we were wanting to try to map this sort of system onto real-world biology. So the particular neurons being used here were meant to map onto real biological neurons, so they're spiking and having sort of low-level biological details. That's sort of an optional approach. So all the techniques I'll talk about here will apply for spiking and non-spiking neurons. But the intent in this, with this particular research, was to see how far we can go with the mapping onto biology. So this particular system has a single visual input. The eye is looking at this sort of screen that now and then there's some digits shown on it. So the digits on the right, the 3, and now we're showing 0, 1. So we're showing a sequence of numbers. The system has to recognize those numbers. It has to remember that sequence of numbers. You're seeing that in the top right. And then the system has to, when it's shown a question mark, it has to know to, oh, okay, sequentially go through its memory and write out the particular elements that it has currently remembered. So that's it has to do an interesting sequencing task, and it has to do a memory task. All of these steps are done in neurons, and in order to write out its answers, it needs to do that by contracting muscles. So you can see the tension on the muscles being shown there in different colors as it's trying to control the arm to write out its answers. So this particular system ended up requiring 2.5 million neurons organized into somewhere between 100 or a couple hundred different groups, and we'll be talking about the various different techniques about how to actually generate this sort of system. But the point here is that it's possible to build systems of this complexity using the techniques that we'll be showing. It's also interesting to note that in this particular case, we were trying to match human behavior. And so in this particular case, when it actually forgets elements in the middle of the list, so you'll notice it just missed writing the 8, but now it completes the list 7 and 3. But it makes mistakes in the middle of the list, which actually matches well to what happens when you get people to do similar tasks. Another important feature of this system is that it's not restricted to doing just one task. But we can get the same system to do different tasks, but we don't rewire the network in order to switch tasks, because that's not how biology would do this. What we actually do instead is we give it different visual stimulus in order to tell it a different task to do. So now, for instance, we can show this task, which is I'm going to show you a digit. Please draw it in that style. So this is showing that it's capable of doing more than just classification of digits. It's able to both recognize that it was a 2 and say, oh, this is a 2 with a loopy bottom, that's on the right, and a 2 with a straight bottom on the left, and control its arm in different ways. So this is at least indicating that it's doing more than classification. Certainly classification, everyone's quite familiar with using deep networks to categorize images, but here we're showing that also more information is available. And then to sort of push things even farther, this here is our example of doing a pattern completion task. So this is a situation where we're going to show it a sequence of numbers, a pattern of numbers. It's being shown slowly individually there on the right, but on the left we have a separate display just so that we can see what was shown. The task is going to be fill in the question mark. It's never seen this sequence before. This is the very first time it's seen this particular pattern, and it needs to fill in the blank. and it will successfully write 5, 5, 5. Same answer that people will give. People find this very easy to do. It's actually very difficult to implement this in traditional computing approaches. This is a variant of a task called the Raven's progressive matrices. It's a standard IQ test. And so there's actually been a number of people who've attempted to model this task, and most of those, and doing it in sort of traditional computing approaches, tends to involve having some sort of fixed list of different patterns, and it tries to figure out which of those patterns it's being shown. But with this sort of neural approach, it turns out that it's relatively straightforward to build a system that can, on a single trial, or the very first time it's shown this particular pattern, successfully learn the results. Okay, so what all of that was meant to do was just sort of impress people that you can build very complicated things using just neural networks. I want to drill down a little bit to show some sort of smaller things as well. So this model here is just doing a very simple learning to move. So the little blue triangle, that is what the brain is controlling, what this neural network is controlling. And the neural network has 3 outputs: move forward, turn left, turn right. And when it starts off, it doesn't even know which of those outputs, like which of its 3 outputs are going forward or turning left or turning right. The only thing it knows is it gets positive reward whenever it gets closer to a green circle. And so what it should do is learn to orient itself and turn itself towards the green dot. Again, when we initialized this, it had never done it. It had no experience with this task, but we're already seeing it start to sort of steer itself towards the green dot, and with a little bit more experience, it will do so more reliably. So yes, whenever it gets to the green dot, we randomly move the green dot, and it can eventually learn to deal with this task. So this is a situation where we can also do some online learning with the neural network and produce useful behavior. The final example I want to show is one that's become really important to us in a sort of a direct application of these approaches. What we're doing here is we are trying to just do that arm control aspect. So in the large network, one of the many things it had to do was move its arm around. In this particular case, we're just simply saying, hey, try to move your hand towards the red dot, but we're also putting unknown dynamics on that hand. So as that hand changes mass, or as the arm encounters resistance, actually controlling the hand is difficult. So for instance, when you are trying to move your hand to a particular location, if you're holding a heavy object, you need to apply more force in order to move your hand where you want to do. And this is something that biology does really quickly and very well, something we don't even really think about. Oh, I have to apply more force to put my hand where I want. And so this model here is based on a model of the mammalian motor control system and cerebellum. And so it is using neurons to do exactly that online learning. Here we're seeing it in simulation, where it's just trying to control this fairly simple arm. But more importantly, we've shown that this works in real physical robots as well. So this video that we're showing here is an arm that is using is trying to move to particular locations. You can see the physical arm on the right. On the top left, you can see the an image of where the arm is, and the red dot is where it's trying to move its hand to. But if you take a look at the real physical arm on the right, as opposed to the simulated the computer simulation of the arm on the left, on the right the arm has a heavy weight on it, and if we weren't learning to adapt to that heavy weight, the forces that the arm would be applying would be completely wrong, and the arm would be at a much lower point in that space. This system is also doing image recognition of small little objects. In particular, it's looking for it's looking for the small Santa Claus that is being held in the hand. And so again, this is doing image recognition of using neurons and doing the motor control using neurons. We'll come back to that example as one that will be useful for the FPGA applications at the end of this section. So all of that was mostly just to show that it is possible to do complicated behavior with neural networks. What I want to do next is talk about how we actually build these sorts of large neural networks, because this isn't a traditional way of doing networks.